Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 13. Ideas and the Mind. Ideas are the terminal evolutionary function of interdimensional activity. They serve out of necessity the development of consciousness, beyond the values idealized by the unconscious ego in a perpetual need for expression. They are a living mental bridge that links the brain to the mind. They are the psychic and psychological lifeblood of an ego under constant pressure to manifest itself in order to fulfill, unwittingly, a karmic role determined before incarnation in a world ruled unknowingly by the law of psychic necessity. Creative ideas are the guarantor of civilized evolution because they ensure the activity of the mind as the channel of consciousness for the benefit of the race, the civilization and, ultimately, the individualized self. They are the measure of the relative evolutionary potential of civilization within the time frame of the race wherein the individual, at the end of a long evolutionary cycle, must be elevated to a universal status of perfected creative independence and psychic attributes. Ideas do not correspond to an ideological finality, although they seem to when expressed forcefully by those who are in power. The advancement of ideas constantly adjusts the abuses and illusions of the past. The mind does not issue from man himself. It pulses through him while ideas cater to and support the illusion that it is of him. This condition gives the ego the age-old illusion of freedom of will, necessary for psychic and psychological equilibrium, until it attains a level of conscious intelligence sufficiently advanced to understand the intimate relationship with psychic forces that mold personal evolution, that of society, and of humanity in general. While the mind transcends ideological dimensions, ideas correspond to man's psychic needs. They allow him to experience psychological reflection in order to live and experience, at the soul level, the impression of belonging to the world and of being the master of it. Consciousness at the end of this cycle is still too primary for the self to see and apprehend its relationship to pre-personal intelligence. Such an inequality depends more on the science of the mind than the nature of ideas. Ideas are simply chronological aspects of the evolutionary development manifested by social forces put into motion through the psychic dynamics of flow and pressure identified as organizational power. In order to understand the relationship of the mind to the psychic dimension of thought, one must be free of the psychological insecurities of the ego to perceive the self. A conscious act more or less devoid of reflection. It then becomes evident that the mind is the creative seat of the self and that the latter reacts to it or acts in harmony with it according to the degree of freedom from the astral coloring of its ideas. When thought is experienced, the ego associates itself with it instead of relating to it in a creative mode. When the mind is increasingly perceived as a pre-personal creative state, ideas are naturally and easily elevated above the threshold of memory, and the ego enters a creative zone that increases the perception of thought to a level beyond the intellect. Such contact with the mind at work allows the self to channel conscious thought and discover that ideas are but the projection of thought energy coupled with the psychological dynamics of the intellect. It is not evident at first that ideas emanate from a mind center truly dissociated from the psychological elements of the personality. The science of the mind begins at the intersection of our psychological and psychic territory. A point rarely investigated objectively in a cultural medium where the individual has been trained to think in terms of definite psychological parameters, easily traceable to the vicissitudes of the personality and its memory. This veils the fact that ideas emanate from dimensional planes that use the personality as a shield against the devastating impact which the sudden and unprepared disclosure of psychic reality would have on the uninitiated ego. Idea levels always correspond to personal reality, and reinforce the subjective thought experience which, in turn, maintains a fictitious certainty of our relationship with the world that conforms to our psychological expectations. Creative and objective consciousness is lost in this exercise, not to mention conscious proximity with the psychic world of the mind that would otherwise open wide the doors of higher perception and understanding. Supramental psychology indicates that the mind includes the infinite relationship of the self, the soul, and the spirit or etheric double, and consciousness of self experiences the existence of such an axis. The physical entity experiences either a conscious or unconscious communication level with the etheric persona or pre-personal thought adjuster, through partially or fully developed telepathic faculties that shatter the illusion of thought emanating from an egocentric source. Psychic contact with parallel dimensions is an essential part of the reality of evolutionary consciousness. A new psychological approach to mind reality is essential if the basis of a perfect science of the mind is to be established. The components of the self should be understood in their order of ascendant function, not from egocentric configurations established since the dawn of philosophy. The mind is truly an accessible dimension of universal dialogue between higher and lower orders of intelligence for the benefit of both. It is not a memory bank confined to intellectual parameters, but a source of intelligence in which prepersonal views are accessible. For the evolutionary development of the race in general, and man in particular, through civilization as its medium of expression. The creative potential of thought depends on the soul vibration and the psychic tension that conditions the evolution of the self. Consequently, the unconscious self cannot focus on the highest vibration of the mind, and lives for the whole duration of his existence on the lower register of thought consciousness, never reaching the full depth of the mind. A new evolutionary psychology could point out the objective difference between consciousness and the mind, and allow the individual to realize his psychic partnership with knowledge which is only accessible via the telepathic connection to higher intelligence reality. Personal evolution can then be satisfied, and the self allowed to gravitate towards a supermental freedom by his inner contact with his higher etheric self. This would put an end to the psychic isolation of the unconscious being. Mental life would be fulfilled through the permanent telepathic bond with the etheric self. It would permit access to the most unreachable facets of reality, initiating the self to the foundation of supermental knowledge or consciousness. The poetic notion that inspiration is a movement of the mind that gratifies the creative needs and impulses of the thinker indicates a rudimentary understanding of the forces at work beyond the human experience. Inspiration, as it is called, only reveals the personalized aspect of the occult relationship between human and other levels of intelligence. Even if it is thought of as an unregulated movement of the psyche, it is truly an interdimensional creative expression, though colored by the psychic profile of the soul that conditions the telepathic connection with the etheric double or spirit force. The notion of inspiration does not in itself explain the creative phenomena. Furthermore, it restricts it to the subjective level of thought experience. Inspiration is a spontaneous function of the mind. The latter has the power of instant prepersonal creative thought construction through the movement of a higher mental activity that veils the inner nature of intelligence. Were we conscious of the different planes of the mind, the notion of inspiration would be instantly replaced by a direct telepathic communication permanently established within the field of consciousness. The creative power of the mind is interdependent with other planes fully dissociated from the human intellect. The understanding of this foundation introduces consciousness to the highest possible levels of knowledge attainable on a planet within its evolutionary time frame. In other words, The inspirational quality of the mind remains an experiential facet of the ego-soul relationship, whereas the communicative aspect of the mind frees the ego from experience and transforms inspiration into a new and permanent form of expression related to the untainted origin of thought itself. Through inspiration thought is colored, whereas in communication, thought ceases to exist as an experiential device of the soul and becomes a tool for revelation. Inspiration can be suspect, for it calls into action psychic forces that cannot be controlled from a perfectly integrated supramental point of view. It is akin to a fire the creative mind cannot extinguish. So important it is to the subjective survival of the self-image. Ideas are processed through the movement of mental energy and constantly adjusted to the evolutionary level of intelligence experience. The more intelligent and creative the consciousness, the more elevating and harmonizing the ideas. The occult or unknown laws of the mind hide full comprehension of the dynamic process of ideas. So the individual is conditioned to their impulses instead of being the ruler of his own mental energy. The unconscious mind constantly puts the mental body into a vibrational or pulsating state. This creates in the self a permanent psychic tension that easily becomes existential stress, until the ego learns how to deal with energy translated into ideas. Too often ideas become a source of experience during which the ego is unwittingly brought to realize the lack of control of its life and its subsequent suffering, which is part of soul evolution, at the expense of the self. Man is a multidimensional being whose physical, psychic and psychological functions correspond to the need for the self to adjust to his mind energy so that his consciousness may in time become permanently stabilized within the human framework. Looking further into the meaning of the mind, the individual is brought to the understanding that his consciousness is based on the rapport between different planes of intelligence activity. Thought is a subjective facet of personal reality, becoming so through the coloring of the unconscious mind that lacks the understanding of the nature of thought itself. Pursuing the development of the thought process beyond the psychological limits of the ignorant self leads to the perception of a contact point between the lower self and a higher mental or psychic plane, the seat of the higher self or creative mind. This perception creates a shock that opens the psyche within the egoic fabric, inviting the self to witness a readjustment of its thought process that facilitates a greater influx of pre-personal data unconditioned by past experience. At this point, the objective reality of the mind becomes one with the ego. Made aware of mental dimensions above its own, accessible through telepathic communication with an intelligence source previously silent because of his unawareness of it. The ego now becomes conscious. The next cycle of evolution will bring into focus the faculty of the self to interact consciously with the psychic mind. A personal psychological and psychic revolution will propel consciousness permanently beyond its past historical limitations. The development of supramental thought will allow global individualization of the psyche at its axis of spirit, soul and self. The soul is the quintessence of present and past experiential memories from which the double, or higher self, programs future incarnated models of experience towards the eventual fusion of soul and spirit. As the mind is brought into conscious focus through the supramental comprehension of the psychic laws of thought, the ego can free itself from the powerful soul or karmic forces. It can expand its telepathic or higher mental relationship with pre-personal intelligence, the source from which unfolds its personal reality. From then on, ideas can partake of an uninhibited process of creative growth imprinted on the psyche by forces freed from the karmic pressures of the soul, and represent the cosmic link between the lower and higher self. The soul cannot prevent the eventual contact of the lower and higher planes of human reality, but it can retard their fusion by its unconscious expression of the forces at its disposal, due to its connection with the astral or death plane. The translation of reality into understandable concepts requires a psychic alliance with the knowable over the thinkable. The mind as a well-grounded science of supramental psychology can throw light on the nature of the psyche. Such an evolution cannot take place through the egocentric manipulation of ideas characterized by rationalism. Supramental consciousness derives its knowledge from the telepathic challenge of contact with the higher mental plane. Ideas and the mind are interrelated but not necessarily complementary. In the former case, they cannot be dissociated from the mind, but in the latter, the unconscious ego does not imbibe necessarily in a creative and pre-natural processing of its ideational energy. If the ego does not experience mental energy in a conscious manner, it is subject to the karmic law of consciousness as it relates to the forces of the soul that influence and color ideas for the purpose of experience, forfeiting a perfect inner equilibrium. When the self becomes conscious of the mind and its complementarity to the flow and creation of ideas, he is able to end the soul's imposition of unconscious experience in a manifestation of real will, as opposed to free will. This karmic law of consciousness making life a consequence of alienated incidents, is replaced when a controlled destiny whose continuous flow of intelligent movement justifies conscious living through an ascendant development of the mind within the parameters of the self's individualized identity. Unconscious ideas are the manifestation of the soul's control over the human experience, where one is forced to admit, regardless of his ideas, that life is a process conditioned by forces beyond his control. The elevation of the human state of consciousness replaces mechanical habits. The human mind is a psychic world accessible to higher intelligence that adjusts the flow of energy within the self to align psychological and psychic reality. The higher mind can only be brought to the consciousness of the ego through the opening of a supramental center that converts psychic energy into boundless creative power. The mind is an inner world of thought communication, not a state. It is perceived as a state because we fail to unravel its subtle inner workings. This is what prevents harmonious understanding between men, as their personalities disrupt the energies of their communication. This egocentric blindness victimizes the self with accumulated disinformation that is a result of the involutionary nature of civilization and societies in general. The basic limitation of human consciousness finds its cause in that the individual is devoid of a developed psychic mental center that would give him access to his inner faculties that put him in conscious contact with objective intelligence, the source of reality. The intellect uses egocentric knowledge, while supermental consciousness creates conditions of mental perception that probe into the mechanics of mind energy. This difference is fundamental to the two states of consciousness and not mutually exclusive to either. While the intellect uses the lower centers of consciousness to understand the mechanical forces of life, supermental intelligence elevates the mind to a level that can actualize the psychic faculties of the individual, giving him independence from karmic forces of the soul responsible for blind experience. Human intelligence is untapped. This boundless energy is available only if self-centered attitudes are transformed into non-egoic, transparent intelligence. The new cycle of conscious development will shed light on the revelations of the past. The self will gradually understand the mechanics of thought that facilitate communication with interdimensional intelligence in harmony with his evolutionary status. He will discover the underworld influences that have manipulated him for thousands of years since his descent into matter. The self will take stock of his own light, the source of consciousness, and confirm his cosmic condition as a free being. The passage to conscious awareness will require profound transformation of self. The individual's inner needs will expand with consciousness into perfect understanding of what initiates of the past could not explain in times of profound human ignorance. The evolutionary development of the mind will lead to the awareness of supramental consciousness. The new growth will come about as the self gradually overthrows the notions of the past in exchange for ideas that bring it closer to its psychic reality. The passage from mental or psychological to supramental or psychic evolution will transform the self's view of life, death and the mysteries. It will be a difficult experience for civilization as its influence on the mind will be brought to question as the self witnesses the legacy of astral illusions that have kept humanity in the dark for thousands of years. The self stands at the crossroads of the past and future of civilization. The self-battle for freedom from mass consciousness will be the greatest ever fought at the individual level. The role of past teachings, regardless of their importance to previous evolutionary consciousness, will be cast aside at the final stage of self-determination through newly found psychic awareness. Consciousness will no longer belong solely to the psychological aspects of reality. It will plunge into the psychic dimensions of the mind to vanquish the psychological guilt syndrome found at the basis of all religions since the dawn of civilization. Consciousness cannot become transparent as long as guilt is part of its makeup. This part of its astral nature precludes, because of the negative manipulation of the emotions, the full development of creative intelligence. The mind is a cosmic phenomenon of human proportion. As its internal laws are brought to light, ideas will come increasingly under human control, leading towards the perfect understanding of the mind's infinite nature. The thought experience must be brought to a new level of awareness that will satisfy the quest for knowledge beyond the astral limits of the subjective ego. The difficult phase now in progress in our societies will serve to install the necessary mechanisms of self-preservation sadly lacking in ages past. The great battle for freedom of expression, even though in apparent decadence today, will tomorrow be seen as the period in which the individual had fought his way, unconsciously, through the dark ages of historical brainwashing that condition all aspects of human intelligence.